Good evening, everyone. My name is Ware Harmon, and I'm the Executive Director of Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of the rest of our staff and our friends at Third Place Books, it's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's virtual presentation of Alvy Ray Smith in conversation with Charles C. Mann. As we get underway, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. We are so glad that you're back with us as we commence another season at Town Hall. It's our 22nd. This will be a year unlike any other. You can be sure of that, with in-person events, virtual events, stuff we're calling hybrid events, which you can figure out what that means. We're also continuing our scaled up podcast In the Moment, which features exclusive interviews of authors, artists, and newsmakers by Jenny Palmer, Steve Scher, and other local correspondents. And meanwhile, many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form in our digital media library. There are many, many ways to engage with Town Hall in this weird tweener time. So tonight's presentation will run around 60 minutes, including Q&A. To integrate our in-person and virtual audience experiences, we've changed the Q&A platform for our programs. To submit your question, please enter meet.psth. I think that's probably going to be Smith, but I have a typo here. So it'll either way, it doesn't matter because you're seeing it on your screen right now as it should properly be. You can also scan the QR code right now with your smart device, and that'll take care of all those awkward URLs. The link will also recur in your chat later, and we'll also explain how the whole technology works when we get to the Q&A. We can't guarantee we'll get to every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible, and you can do your part by keeping your question concise. For those of you who want to view the program with closed captions, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. Town Hall's adding new events every day. Upcoming events include a look at quarantines, past and very present, with authors Nicola Twilley and Jeff Maynaw, stories of avian life with Birdpedia author Christopher Leahy, a brief history of motion with journalist Tom Standage, a compendium of dinosaur lore with zoologist Darren Nash, a musical exploration of artist Susanna Ryan's Seattle Walk Report in the first event of this year's Bushwick Book Club series, and a celebration of 30 years of Savage love with the irrepressible Mr. Dan Savage himself. Those last two events will welcome live audiences to the building, and you won't want to miss them. So check our website or subscribe to our e-newsletter to get the latest updates. Town Hall's programs are made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our arts and culture programs are supported by For Culture, Arts Fund, Seattle's Office of Arts and Culture, the Nesholm Family Foundation, the Caffin Foundation, and the Wincote Foundation Northwest. But as many of you know, Town Hall is at heart a member-supported organization, and I want to thank all of our members watching tonight. If you share Town Hall's vision of a healthy community engaged in the arts, science, and culture where folks have a voice, we hope you'll consider supporting us tonight with your contribution or by becoming a member. Even a rich and fulsome conversation this evening will leave you wanting to know more about the history of the pixel. And the best way to get your more is to purchase your own copy of Alvy Ray Smith's book. You can use the link in the chat below to pick up that copy at Third Place Books. That's the fastest way to your goal, and the way that preserves our local independent booksellers for that moment when we're finally all fully unleashed from this time of COVID. And with all of that, Dr. Alvy Ray Smith co-founded two successful startups of some repute, Pixar and Altamira. He was the first director of computer graphics at Lucasfilm, an original member of the Computer Graphics Lab of the New York Institute of Technology, and the first graphics fellow at Microsoft. He was at Xerox PARC for the birth of the personal computer, the internet, and some of the earliest color pixels. He has received 2 Technical Academy Awards and directed the Genesis demo in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. A member of the National Academy of Engineering, a fellow of both the American Association for the Advancement of Science and of the American Society of Genealogists. He's also been published widely in theoretical computer science, computer graphics, and scholarly genealogy. He holds 4 patents and has created many pieces of computer art, including Sunstone, held in the collection of New York's Museum of Modern Art. A 3-time National Magazine Award finalist, Charles C. Mann is a correspondent for The Atlantic, Science, and Wired, and has also written for Fortune, the New York Times, Smithsonian, and Vanity Fair, among other publications. His full-length books include 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus from 2008, followed in 2011 by 1493, Uncovering the New World Columbus Created. In 2018, Mann published The Wizard and the Prophet, which details 2 competing theories about the future of agriculture, population, and the environment. Alvy Ray Smith's new book, A Biography of the Pixel, is the subject of this evening's discussion. And all that said, a savvy internet sleuth has informed me that today's also Alvy's birthday. I hate doing this to you. I'm so sorry. So when we get to the Q&A, maybe you can make that a subject of the evening too. After all that, please join me in welcoming Alvy Ray Smith and Charles C. Mann.
Good day.
Thank you. Thank you very much for listening to us. And I should probably begin by saying that the rise of computing is, in my view, one of the three innovations in the last 100 years that has made the most impact on human life. And the other two are the invention of antibiotics and the Haber-Bosch process, which made artificial fertilizer possible and essentially empowered the Green Revolution. In many ways, the computer rise is the least understood of these three, partly because it's still happening and partly because computers have become so integrated into the fabric of everyday life that they are hard to see. And this is one of the reasons that we're very lucky to hear Alvy Ray, one of the most important participants in one of the most important aspects of this rise, which is the complete merging of all visual imagery and computing. And so far, he is the only person and the only participant to explain in detail what and how it happened in a wonderfully interesting book. The sort of book that gives me the highest praise, which is that I kept reading it and going, I didn't know that. It's that kind of book. So, but I listened to this long introduction. I'd like to ask you by what sort of Homeric epithet you'd like to be known. I mean, is it okay to just call you the co-founder of Pixar? Should we call you this fundamental computer scientist, sidetrack painter, a master genealogist, an actual title, a two-time Oscar winner, and the 13th generation Southwesterner, a paid-up member of this clan of rogue Canadian intellectuals? I mean, what should we call you? What do you want to be known as?
I like co-founder of Pixar. That's enough for me. That's pretty good.
Okay, that'll
very
do
proud
it.
of that role. Yeah.
Okay, so then I'd like to mention that on all that list of things that you have done, one of the things that didn't come up was that you're now a writer of books, and in addition, actually a writer of a rather good one, which is, as a writer myself, annoying that you can just drop into my profession and do so well. So why don't we start off by reading a little bit from it that will both give you a flavor of what the book is like and say something about what it's about.
Okay, so here's the book, page 2. The notion of the digital, discrete and spiky, didn't fully exist until 1933. At mid-century, 1950, there were only a couple of digital pictures in existence. The few people who knew about them actually thought that they were frivolous distractions from the more serious projects of digital computers. All the other pictures in the world were made and viewed with analog means, oil on canvas, ink on paper, and chemical emulsion on photographic film, to name a few. But at the millennium, 2000, there was an unheralded event, the Great Digital Convergence, a single new digital medium, the all-encompassing bit, replaced nearly all analog media. The bit became the universal medium, and the pixel, a particular packaging of bits, conquered the world. It became possible to remove a painting from its, so to speak, from its canvas. As a consequence, most pictures in the world are now digital. Analog pictures have all but vanished relative to ubiquitous digital imagery. Museums and kindergartens are among the few reliable places to find the analog.
This is, essentially what your book is about, is how this came to pass. And one of the things that's really quite striking to me, from a modern perspective, is the idea that people back then, when computing started, thought that digital imagery was a distraction, as he said, was trivial. When in fact, watching images on computers was basically what half the world does with half of its time. How could they have missed this? I mean, what did they actually think it was for?
When I was a kid, well, first of all, I'll admit my age now that my birthday's been revealed. I was born before computers. In 1943, there were no computers. The idea had been invented, but the actual machines didn't exist yet. The first use of computers that I encountered was my Aunt Lucy in New Mexico showed me a clanking I think it was electromechanical relay computer in Las Cruces, New Mexico, that did telemetry of the missiles at White Sand missile range next door to us. In other words, it was doing number crunching. And I think that was the first use of computers, and a lot of people probably believe that's what computers actually do. I spent quite a bit of time in my book trying to disabuse people of that view, that small view of computers. When it comes to pixels, though, one of the things, first of all, making pictures, I did find all kinds of strange attitudes about pictures. They were frivolous. It was forbidden. It wasn't a decent thing to do with a fancy machine like a computer. But you know, there are still remnants of that. There are still misperceptions of pixels rampant today. So I'd like to start my slideshow right now and show you what people think pixels look like. And if you think pixels look like this, then I want you to pay particularly close attention. I'd say most people in the world think pixels are little squares of solid color abutting one another like this. I got this picture, by the way, from Google. I typed in pixels and said, show me pictures of pixels. And this is a sampling of what Google gave me. I'm here to tell you that none of these are accurate. Pixels have never been little squares, ever, not even in the beginning. So one of the questions is, why has this pixelation notion become so prevalent that people almost insist? When I say it's not so, they just say, yes, it is. I've seen them. No, you haven't. We'll try to argue why you haven't seen them. Okay, so let's go right back to the beginning and find out what a pixel really is. It starts with this guy Fourier, Joseph Fourier, in about 1800, the French Revolution, call it. And I'm not going to spend much time on him, although I spent a whole chapter on him in the book. I just want to remind you of his famous theorem, which says, basically, the world's all music. For example, music, most people know this, is a sum of sound waves that look like this, of various frequencies, how fast they wiggle, and various amplitudes, how high they crest. You can add those very regular waves together to get any music. Not much of a surprise, but he also said you can get any sound, no matter how irregular, by adding these regular waves together. He went further. He said, we can go into 2 dimensions as well. If you extrude these beautiful waves out of the plane and then look down on them, you get corrugations, which are the 2-dimensional equivalent of the pictures at the top. Fourier's result, his musical result, is you can add together these waves of this form, these regular waves of this form, to get any picture. That's kind of a surprise, but that idea that everything is frequencies has driven the technological world for over a century. I only mention it because on its shoulders came the idea that I want to tell you about now, the sampling theorem, which is the major driving idea behind the modern world, especially the media world. It defines what a pixel is. That's why I'm spending a little time on it. And the guy who brought us the sampling theorem was a surprise to me, a huge surprise. Being educated in America, I was taught that Claude Shannon proved the sampling theorem, but it turns out not to be true. And I think the reason we give him credit and not the guy who actually did it was because this guy who actually did it was a Russian communist. And during the Cold War, of course, we couldn't give a commie credit for something as important as a sampling theorem. His name is Vladimir Kotelnikov. This is a picture of him in about 1933 when he published the proof of the sampling theorem in Russian, which changed everything. Now, I can't read this Russian, but I can read the mathematics, and the mathematics is exactly the mathematics of the sampling theorem as I now practice it, including the nuance. I'll get into what the sampling theorem is in just a moment, but I've got to tell you some of the fascinating things I discovered about this guy, Kotelnikov. Well, first of all, he's no slouch. He comes from a long line of brilliant mathematicians, at least 7 generations long, all the way back to the great Euler. He came to America. Kotelnikov came to America in 1957 and told us that Russia was going to put up a Sputnik before they put it up. He told us. And then the last picture I found of him was this one. He's the old man. It's 2003. It's the 70th anniversary of that paper at the top, the proof of the sampling theorem. Vladimir Putin is knighting him in the Kremlin, or whatever the equivalent of knighting is in Russia. All I want you to remember is that shape right there. I call it a spreader, and you'll see why in a couple of minutes. So what is this? What is this great idea from which the whole media world derives? what is the sampling theorem? So let's do a one-dimensional case and then go into 2 dimensions in a moment. Think of this as a sound wave. It's the amplitude of the sound versus time. Time proceeds to the right, and that straight line is 0 loudness. What Kotelnikov taught us with his sampling theorem is that you can, if you place regularly spaced dots along that given sample, that given signal, at a certain rate that I'll explain in a moment, then you can throw away all the rest of the points in the signal. I hope you were listening closely. He said, if you space these samples, and these are called samples, of course, if you place these sample dots appropriately, then you can throw away the infinity of dots, infinity of points on the signal between each pair of dots and not lose anything. That's astonishing. All right. And here's where Fourier comes in. Remember, Fourier said that any one-dimensional signal is a sum of regular waves. Well, Kotelnikov said, find the Fourier wave of highest frequency in the sum that represents the given signal and sample it twice that rate. If you do that, then you can throw away everything but the samples and not lose anything. So that's the first half of the theorem. These are samples. They contain all the information of a continuous signal. It seems like something from nothing, doesn't it? Okay, here's the rest of the theorem. How do you get back, say 10 years later, you've got these samples and you want to get back to the original signal. How do you do it? Do you remember this shape? It's the spreader. I told you to remember it from the 1933 paper. This is the ideal spreader, and unfortunately, those wiggles go out to infinity in both directions. So this is infinitely wide, and in the real world, we cannot use infinitely wide things. So we have to replace the ideal spreader with a really good approximation. And I submit that this is a really good approximation. It's pretty much the same shape, except it goes to 0 and has finite width. Well, it's finite width, we can use that in the real world. Kotelnikov said, take the spreader, and put a copy of it at each sample. In my terms, I'd say spread each sample. You adjust the height of the spreader to be the height of the sample, and then you add up the results. That bold curve at the top is the original signal that's been restored. That's the magic. Somehow the infinity has been reestablished that it looks like we threw away. The infinities have to be carried in the spreader. So let's generalize that result to pictures. In the case of pictures, the spreader looks like this. And I just dropped a guillotine through the top of that little mountain to show you that the cross section is that same spreader shape that we use for the sound example in the previous slide. So, and we call the samples, in the case of 2 dimensions, pixels. There it is. That's the definition of pixel. It's a sample of a 2-dimensional continuous surface. And this is a picture of one pixel being spread by a spreader to reconstruct the original picture that sample represents. I want you to notice 2 things. One, a pixel exists only at a point, 0-dimensional. You cannot see a pixel. That surprises most people. You can't see a pixel, but you can see a spread pixel, spread by a spreader. So what's the spreader? What do you think the spreaders are on a device such as cell phone? It's those little glowy spots on your display. Those little glowy spots are the spreaders. They are not, they're sometimes called pixels, but that's a mistake. They're not pixels. They're these little continuous overlapping things from which we reconstruct the original continuous image that the pixels only represent. Second thing I want you to notice that I haven't mentioned a little square even once. There are no little squares in the sampling theorem. That's a complete misrepresentation. So I have one idea about where it came from. I made this picture of 14 pixels using Photoshop. And if you're like me, I can't see that even though they're spread pixels. So what we do is we use a feature that most apps have called magnify or zoom, and you get this result. Therefore, we believe that the small picture must have been composed of little squares. But it's not true, folks. It's a dirty trick. that we should get off, we should get rid of it because it's made people believe that pixels are squares. What zoom does is replace each pixel. Suppose we're zooming by a factor of 100. We replace each pixel with a 100 by 100 square array of copies of that same pixel, which looks like, what a surprise, a square, but it's not a picture of this up close. If you do the proper magnification of this picture, you get this, which is, you'll see there are no squares, or you're looking down on those little hillocks that I showed you earlier, and they overlap. So I'm going to stop my share now and get back to Charles.
It's fascinating. One of the things I like so much about your book is not only do you have this kind of incredibly lucid and interesting technical explanation, but then you go beyond it to talk about what happened when that came into the real world and why. And one of the key things that you talk about in the sort of history of it is that you have a kind of theory about how technological progress happens in our world today. And you talk about these three concepts of the idea, the chaos, and the tyrant. And so I think I need to ask, from the point of view of all the people listening, what's all that about?
Well, I was kind of shocked. You know, it took me 10 years to research this book, and I was amazed at how often I found the received histories of high technologies were just bogus. They were full of errors, and they were wrong. They honored the wrong people. They seemed to be, you know, aggrandizing a certain person or a certain country or a certain institution. And I finally realized that it was just it's because people try to tell the story of high technology as a simple narrative based on a single hero, and it just doesn't work like that. So I finally came up with this notion that seemed to describe all the different histories I did in this book pretty well. It doesn't completely map, but it's the idea of a triad, I call it. So there's an idea. We have a great idea in a technology. We have some kind of chaos that drives that idea into fruition. We need it. And then there's usually some tyrant or tyranny that protects the creators, usually unknowingly, while they develop the idea. So let's go back to Fourier. I kind of slid over him really fast in that slideshow. Fourier, his great idea was the world's all music. You can add up these regular ways to get irregular signals or irregular pictures. The chaos was the French Revolution. And his tyrant was, and this is what amazing story is, Napoleon Bonaparte himself. He and Fourier clashed again and again and again. I've got the details in the book. What Fourier did, what Napoleon did was he exiled Fourier to the town of Grenoble to keep him out of Paris, because he didn't want this loudmouth Fourier in Paris telling people about Napoleon's military mistakes in Egypt. It was exile. Fourier knew it was exile, but basically it was a posh job. He was governor of the province, and he had all this free time and space with which he proved his famous theorem that's changed the whole world. And then I could, you know, I think I'll start a slideshow now where I explain that, you know, I use the same three ideas to get from the original computers and pixels to the Toy Story. Okay?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, I'm going to start up another share here. Okay, so one of the surprises, you know, like I said, many surprises hit me in this book. Just a second. Well, I want to get rid of that square. I guess it's going to stay there. Please ignore the square on the screen. This is a picture of Baby, the first computer. I found that, much to my surprise, the first computer was named Baby, for starters. It was built in 1948, when I was 5 years old, by the way. And when I went to visit Baby in Manchester, England, where it was built, I was shown this display. Its display, and on its display was this image. And the word Pixar was scrolling to the right. So the lesson is the first computer had pixels and could animate. Who knew? Pixels and computers have been associated from the very, very beginning. And by the way, notice there are no little squares. Here's the actual first picture ever displayed on baby's display. All right, so baby happened, you see it at the lower left here in 1948 during what I call Epic One. This is the era of dinosaurs, when computers got bigger as they got more powerful, and they got huge and they covered acres and they weighed tons, but they weren't very smart, to be honest. And then in 1965, an amazing thing happened. I call it the beginning of Epic Two of the history of computers, described by Moore's Law. Now, this is my version of Moore's Law. We can talk about it later. Everything good about computers gets better by a factor of 10 every 5 years. I can say it, but it's almost impossible for us human beings to understand what that means. But I've drawn a picture of it just to kind of put some of the numbers in your mind. In 1965, when Gordon Moore announced it, the factor was 1. By the way, I made my first computer graphic in that year. And today, it's sitting at 100 billion. In other words, everything good about computers today is 100 billion times better than it was in 1965. It's impossible to wrap your mind around that, but that is the supernova powerhouse that's driven everything I'm saying today, my entire career and yours. One of the things that did, gee, I wish I could get rid of that square. One of the things it did was it gave us the first color pixels. And I went to find them. I thought we had them at Xerox PARC, but we didn't. They occurred on a simulator built for the Apollo Moon project. And there's a photograph from its display. The first color pixels happened in 1967 as a result of Moore's Law. And not only that, not only it's the first color pixels, but it's the first 3D colored shaded graphics. Now, this is the Super Paint program at Xerox PARC several years later, when I had my first brush with color pixels with a paint program, Super Paint, built by my best friend, Dick Schaup. I had grown up in New Mexico painting oils on canvas, and I was an artist. And I was good at computers, and here was a chance to put the two together, and I leapt at it. But I could also program, so I added the hue, saturation, and brightness algorithm that you can see at the top. But Xerox fired me because they decided not to do color. Or maybe it's because of what I looked like, which was this at the time. And anyhow, they said it was because they decided not to do color. So I went in search of the next color pixels that I could get my hands on, and found them at this fabulous place on the North Shore of Long Island, just outside of New York City, a place called the New York Institute of Technology that was owned and ran by this man, Alexander Schur, who would become the first of 3 patrons for the group that became Pixar. The other 2 are George Lucas and Steve Jobs. People have heard of them, but nobody seems to have heard of Alexander Schur, who was the first and perhaps the craziest. And he basically lost everything, but he treated us extremely well. He had cobbled together several estates, and the mansions on those estates were the buildings on his campus. For example, this mansion was where we did video, and we did computer graphics through the woods in another mansion. Alexander Schur was making a movie. He had a complete cell animation studio on this campus, making a movie the old-fashioned way, cell animation way, called Tubby the Tuba. And his idea was, let's use the computer to make that work better. It's sort of the right idea, but he was way too early. What he did for us, for me personally, was he bought us the first 24-bit color pixels in the world. Now, up until then, the most color people had was 256 colors. He gave us 24-bit pixels, so we were the first people in the world to have 16 million colors at our fingertips, which, by the way, is what you have available on your cell phone today. It's sort of become the standard. He bought us a frame buffer, as we called them every then. It's only 500 by 500 pixels, but it cost him $1 million in today's dollars. And he did that just because we asked for it. But by the way, I met a guy named Ed Catmull there. He and I invented the Alpha Channel, and the group of us decided that and here comes the idea, we should be the first group in the world to make the movie, meaning the first digital movie, completely digital movie. We quickly decided that this guy, Alex Schur, wasn't the guy So we leapt to Marin County to join George Lucas when he had asked us to. And while we were there, I directed the Genesis demo, as we were mentioned, in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, which wasn't George's movie, by the way. But it was the first time on the big screen of this group of geniuses that we put together at Lucasfilm that would later become the heart and soul of Pixar. 2 years later, you'll notice there are no characters in Star Trek II. 2 years later, we decided to show the world that we could do character animation. So I'd hired one of the world's best animators, John Lasseter, and directed it in this piece called Andre and Wally-B. But what I'm really showing off to you here is character animation, by the way. But what I'm showing to you is that we had solved motion blur. It was a key technical solution. These are 4 successive frames from that piece. But about that time, George and Marshall Lucas got divorced. And, in California, like Washington State, community property state, half the fortune goes with each spouse. So I went to my partner, Ed, and I said, Ed, George never knew who we were, could figure out who we were. He's just lost half his fortune. He's going to fire us. And it would be a sin for us to let this world-class group of geniuses disperse. Now, Ed and I knew with cold fact that we could not yet do a movie. We needed 5 more years of Moore's Law before we could have enough horsepower to do a movie. So we decided that we would start a company called Pixar that would manufacture a piece of hardware, the Pixar image computer. And we wrote the business plan for that company. And eventually, and we had a hell of a hard time raising money for it. We went through 35 venture capital firms and 10 corporations who all said no, but we finally persuaded this guy, Steve Jobs, to be our venture capitalist. He didn't buy us, by the way. He was our venture capitalist. And for 5 years, we were a not very good hardware company that probably would have failed several times if we had had anybody but Steve Jobs funding. And sure enough, at the end of that hard period, 1991, Moore's Law arrived, and Disney knocked on our door and says, okay, boys, let's do that movie you always wanted to make. And of course, that movie was Toy Story. So I guess I could say, while I'm stopping the share here, I guess what I can say is that the idea was the movie. The chaos was either the 60s, or I think it was actually the disruption of Moore's Law was the chaos. And the tyrant, at least in my case, was Steve Jobs. And even though he and I didn't like each other at all, he came through with the money for whatever reason. I think his reasons were completely wrong, to save himself embarrassment. But the bottom line is he came through with the money. He did right even without knowing it. Back to you, Charles.
So one of the things that's really striking about this is that when you talk about Moore's Law, that chart is extraordinary, right? And it's something that has tremendously shaped, as you say, contemporary life, and everybody knows about it, but almost nobody really realizes how anomalous that kind of growth is. And in fact, often you hear, well, we're just going to let Moore's Law switch on for the next thing, for some other innovation, like a vaccine or something like that. And it never works like that. Moore's Law is just completely on its own.
Moore's Law is exactly and only about integrated circuit chips. And the only reason, I spent a lot of time thinking about it in the book, and the reason it continues to give us improvements is because the bit takes no space. A bit is just a distinction. All you need is some way to form a distinction. There is no ultimate smallest. I guess there is. You get down to a quark or something, there might be a limit, but we're orders of magnitude away from quarks and atoms and things like that. Moore's Law says every 5 years you get a factor of 10 increase. Well, a factor of 10, I call it an order of magnitude because human beings, we puny humans, we can't think beyond one order of magnitude. And yet Moore's Law has given us 11 orders of magnitude since 1965. It's impossible for any one of us to predict what it means to get that many orders of magnitude. By the way, it's going to hit 1 trillion X in just a few years. Do you know what it means? I don't. We just have to get there to see what it means. I know the numbers are going to be bigger and awesome, and it's going to feel different, but I can't tell you what it is until you get there. I guess I should also say people are always prophesying the death of Moore's law, but the engineers who give us Moore's law improvements, they're suffering from the same order of magnitude limit as the rest of us. They have to get to one stage before they can figure out how to go to the next stage. And sure enough, I've heard recent announcements of yet denser and denser integrated circuit chips. I don't think it's over yet.
Extraordinary. Now, equally extraordinary, this is sort of a lame segue, but I'm going to make it, is that after doing this, you go on to Microsoft and suddenly you make a tremendous swerve and you spend years working on genealogy and become actually a master genealogist. So I have to ask you, what appealed to you about this? And also, how did genealogy help you write this book, which is in some sense a genealogy, but is also a straight out history and a lecture of science, and it's more like Gödel, Escher, Bach than any other book that I can think of.
Thank you. People laugh at genealogy because a lot of people try to prove how wonderful they are because they're akin to somebody famous. Well, that's malarkey genealogy. Scholarly genealogists just simply figure out what the facts are and prove every single point they make. So basically, it's the hardcore work of history is the way I look at it. And I used it again and again. Yes, I've been honing my skills for decades. I'm a fellow of the American Society of Genealogists. I've been honing my skills for a long time, and I've used them again and again and again in the preparation of this book. For example, the guy who invented the movies was somebody I'd never heard of, William Kennedy Laurie Dixon. I bet you never heard of him. People usually think it's Edison or Edward Muybridge or the Lumiere brothers. It's not any of those guys. It's this guy, William Kennedy Laurie Dixon. Who's he? Well, I used my genealogical skills to master who he was, and he's got an amazing story. It's in the book.
Same thing.
Another.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say another example is I heard a mention somewhere that Vladimir Kotelnikov, this communist, had come to America twice, and I said, really? And so I did what all genealogists know how to do. We go to the immigration records. They're out there online. You can go look them up yourself. I looked up Vladimir Kotelnikov. There he was. He came in on the same boat to America that Alan Turing had come to Manhattan on the Berengaria. Coincidence, of course, not at the same time. And that's how I learned. That gave me the clue I needed to find out that he came and he told us about Sputnik and so forth, things that people had not even heard of before. So I find it an extremely valuable tool for ferreting out details, historical details, so we can get this story right finally.
And at the same time, you're also looking at other things. And so we should probably, before questions and Q&A, please send them on if you have any. You should ask you what you're doing now, in addition to writing this book and promoting it.
Yeah, well, I end the book in 2000, more or less, but Moore's Law has done a factor of 10,000 since then, in the 20 years since 2000. Another 10,000x has happened. And the results have been awesome, right? And I couldn't have predicted them. I heard about virtual reality since the 60s, but I always kind of hated it because you put this bucket on your head and it was sweaty and hot and the graphics were lousy. And all of a sudden, virtual reality has become pretty darn serious. In fact, I'm an advisor for a virtual reality startup company in Silicon Valley called Baobab Studios, partly to keep my hands in the entrepreneurial spirit of young people in Silicon Valley. It's really, really an exciting place to be. And AI, I'm tracking AI. I started at Stanford in 1965 in AI, this new thing called artificial intelligence, and have been tracking it ever since. And it seems like, boy, things are starting to happen now. Do we have intelligent machines? I'm not quite convinced of that yet, but things are looking, I talk about it in the book where I fantasize a bit about I thought I would be able to understand what an intelligent machine actually did when it came along. And now I'm of the opinion, no, kind of the very nature of an intelligent machine is you can't understand it probably. That's one of the features. I'm trying to wrap my head around that notion still. Dyson's third law of robotics.
Anyway, if any of you have questions, please send them on. We have one that immediately follows from, which is, where did your passion for genealogy actually come from? I mean, was it always there, or is it something that popped into your life?
Oh, it was kind of always there. I had a great aunt in this far off place called New Jersey. You know, I grew up in the West. There was this place called back East, and New Jersey was this really far off country. Very strange place. And I had a great aunt, whatever that means, there. And she passed her genealogy scrawlings in a composition book to my mom, who passed it to me. And I deciphered as a teenager, I think, the scrawlings of my great aunt. And I realized she's talking about revolutionary soldiers. And all of a sudden I said, you mean us in the West in New Mexico could have revolutionary soldiers in our past? Who could have thought that? And I got completely fascinated and started learning the ropes. It took me a lot of years to learn the ropes, but I got pretty good at it. I think one of the reasons I really enjoy it is because it's a lot like programming. You've got 100 balls in the air at the same time. They all have to make logical sense. There's a formal language we use to describe everything, and everything has to come down in logical order at the end. It's programming.
You also have a question. You started as a painter, I think, and have you kept your hands in it? And we have a question, which is, how do you think the visual character of the Pacific Northwest influenced your digital art? Did?
Oh, okay. Yes, I started out. I had an uncle George Gray in Las Cruces, New Mexico, was an artist, and I was the only relative that he would allow in his studio as a kid. As long as I just was absolutely silent, I could sit on the floor and watch him paint. So I learned how to stretch canvas and prepare brushes and clean them and mix colors and so forth. And I love the smell of linseed oil and turpentine and so forth. And so I painted pictures, but I was also really good at math and physics. So yeah, it was when I saw that paint program at Xerox PARC, I went, whoa, that's for me. And of course, out of that basically came Pixar, I would say. Do I still paint? No, I decided that I would probably be a better tool maker than creative artist in the long run. There's something else you asked, but I forgot. Yeah.
Well, that's if you thought that the visual character of the Pacific Northwest has influenced any of your digital art or the things that you worked on.
I don't think so. I certainly love the visual aspect of the Pacific Northwest. Of course, I lived in Seattle for many years on Bainbridge and just love the place. So I love to count the volcanoes that you can see on a clear day. Yeah, I miss those down here in Berkeley.
So what were you doing here in the Northwest? Was this when you were working for Microsoft? Is what that would brought you?
Yeah, that's what took me up there was Microsoft. I started another company after Pixar called Altamira Software, and Microsoft snapped it up, put golden handcuffs on me for 4 or 5 years. Had to go live in Seattle, darn it, to to make my stock vest, which I was happy to do and raise my family there. Love it, love that place.
Mm-hmm. You think should we mention that you had a famous feud with Steve Jobs, or you?
Oh, I don't mind talking about it. I think maybe it's pretty well known that I said he was my personal tyrant. He and I just basically didn't like each other a whole lot, and maybe that's enough said. He would say things, and I'd say that's not true, Steve, and then it came to a head finally with the infamous whiteboard incident that Isaacson covers very well in his book about Steve Jobs. So I'm not going to raise that again. It was like basically we screamed at each other this far apart, and it was ugly, ugliest thing that ever happened to my life. And I had to get him out of my life, which I did. So I thank him for keeping us alive when it was important, but no thank you for all the rest of it.
So if you're, tell me what you think about, and you talk about this in the book, where you see, at least in the short-term future, where you think, augmented reality, virtual reality, what kinds of things do you think people can do with them?
Yeah, well, I'm watching mixed reality very closely. It's a hard problem, it seems to me, but we have lots of geniuses who are working away at it. So VR is an entirely synthesized stereo world that you experience inside goggles. Uh, AR is you mix 3D computer graphics with the real world that's scanned in through your goggles, or that you can actually see as you move around. So it's basically a superposition of graphics onto scanned in imagery. Now, mixed reality goes the next step. It extracts a 3D model from the scanned in image. So like I'm looking at your office right now, Charles, in mixed reality, somehow the program has to extract the three-dimensional geometry that describes what I'm seeing, puts that model into the memory where my computer graphics model exists, merges the two, and then objects in the real world and objects in the virtual world have to figure out how to shadow each other and be lit by each other and be transparent to each other. And there are a lot of hard problems in there, but I think we'll see some amazing things. There already are amazing things coming out of that study.
We have an excellent question, which is, what do you actually call the part of a screen that we call a pixel by mistake?
A display element. That's a good question. I didn't say. I actually avoid. Pixel is an abbreviation for picture element, as most people know. Those and pixels are universal, right? The pixels in my file on my cell phone, I can send to you on your computer, and you can look at them. They're a constant of the universe. Display elements, those little glowy spots, differ from device to device, manufacturer to manufacturer, and over time. There's nothing constant about them at all. So it's just it's a category mistake to confuse the two things, right? It's that they're just different. I guess one way to say it is, I've got billions of pixels stored in files in this cell phone, but I can only see megapixels on the display because that's the number of display elements I have.
Right.
And those display elements, so you can't see the pixels, and they're in there. You can't see them. To see them, you got to have the display elements light up.
Right.
The display elements are the spreaders. Spreaders are analog. So what you're looking at is a continuous image that's been reconstructed for our eyes, because that's what our eyes know about. It's a piece of magic, by the way. The sampling theorem is one of the most beautiful pieces of magic to come down the pike. I explain all kinds of stuff by it in the book. Movies too. Why do movies work?
Section.
Yeah.
So we have another question that follows up on that, which is, okay, there's this word pixelization. Is that
it came after the fact, right? It was people. I think people want to believe that pictures from a computer are these little blocky arrays, because computers are rigid and linear and lined up in rows. No, a computer is the most malleable instrument tool ever invented by human beings. It is not limited at all in grace by rigid geometry or linear movement or any of those things that, by the way, in the early days, everybody thought the pictures were. In the early days, we thought straight lines had to have stair steps in them because that's all we could do at the time. Completely wrong, of course. I mean, just look at the screens we're looking at right now. There aren't any little squares and everything is graceful. Or another example are the avatars we're starting to see now of human beings that are absolutely convincing in emotional close-up. There's nothing ungraceful at all about those little glowy spots that are driven by pixels. There are no little squares there, folks. It's just, people say, but I magnify. No, magnifying is a dirty trick.
It might be also because photographic grain, that's what we think of when we think of,
but grain, but that's random, right?
At
least that's not little rows and columns of little squares. At least it's got some randomness to it. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a follow-up question. Do you think there would be more tools to create digital imagery than there are now these days? It seems like the focus has gone wildly towards consumption as opposed to creation.
Oh, well, that's an interesting point. I don't think we can say it with Moore's law is all that's an expression of. there's this explosion of possibility going on, and we poor human beings are scrambling along trying to figure out, now what can we do with this now? Oh wow, there's an idea. I think,
Yeah.
let me make a strong statement here. I haven't raised it at all today, but we are bound in computer graphics by a choice that we make on purpose. I call it the central dogma. All the Pixar movies are made inside the central dogma. All movies, all the computer digital movies are built inside the central dogma. We will model using Euclidean geometry and Newtonian physics and Renaissance, and we project into 2D and Renaissance perspective. There's nothing about a computer that requires those three assumptions. That's a choice. I call it the symphonic form or the central dogma of computer graphics. So what I want to urge is any artists that are out there is start thinking about breaking out of the central dogma. Show us what else is out there. There are infinite worlds to explore that don't honor the central dogma.
Sounds like a challenge for the future.
I hope the generations of artists start showing us.
So maybe that's a good way to end. We're getting close to an hour. I know that the town hall people want to wrap things up. So maybe
okay. So I guess
you have like 30 seconds. Do you have any final thoughts, Alvy?
No, I think that's been a pretty good discussion, Charles. Let's hand it over. Let's hand it back to the town hall people. Bye, everybody.
They are coming on.
Oh, thank you both so much. That was really fun and very informative. I really loved listening to both of you talk. So once again, you can pick up a copy of the book. We have a link so that you can get it from our partner bookseller in the chat. And I hope everyone has a great night. Thank you all for being here.